All right. Analyzing data from satellites, researchers attribute the staircase Cusp signature to its bursty merging or the reconstruction of the merging rate in the cusp. However, bursty or the impulsive reconnection at the cusp is a different from reconnection at Dungy's four neutral points, which are activated by the solar wind's pressures and anti-parallel field shear. To understand the difference, space physics have collected data on the staircase cusp. Saying Hope of the University of Oslo in Norway interpreted particle data from an overflight at Svalbard by F-13 DMSP spacecraft that recorded a long stepwise poleward retraction of the band of the auroral emission in the Cusp region. Then in April 2000 at the General Assembly in Nice, France, and the Department of Physics at the University of Oslo and the University of Leicester, UK, reported a study of ionospheric signatures of plasma entry and momentum transfer at the dayside magnetopause during northern IMF at the cusp. Ground observations of the dayside aurora and the ionospheric ion drift from the Cutlass radar was obtained from the three spacecraft. The optical instruments also recorded a long stepwise poleward retraction and latitudinal widening of the band of the auroral emission in the Cusp region. Let's look closer at the process of the staircase formation at the cusp. All right, flux transfer events. The staircase cusp is identified with the ionospheric signature of the flux transfer event. Russell state that the most noticeable signature of the FTE is its positive, then negative signature. Russell defines an FTE as magnetic flux being transported, a phenomenon with a beginning and end. These events result in plasmoids, large bundles of magnetic flux, and plasma moving tailward, or the faster moving flux ropes discussed earlier. Put simply, the impulsive or bursty merging is a type of magnetic reconnection signaled by the staircase signature and FTEs. Space physicists believe that the Turing instability begins the complex reconnection process. Their analysis shows that the connection of instability start with a population of electrons that is not trapped in the current sheet. These electrons then short the electric field and that stabilizes the mode, creating a gap for entry where it formerly blocked. University of Maryland 2002, a magnetic island then forms on the interface. The Turing mode displaces magnetic field lines outside, but the original topology is still retained. On the other hand, field lines inside have broken the reconnection, exhibiting a different topology. The formation mechanism of magnetic island or FTE is controversial among space physics because it depends on solar winds and magnetospheric conditions. Physicists also refer to FTEs as Cusp diamagnetic cavities, bubbles, and magnetic islands. Much study is currently devoted to the magnetopause low latitude boundary layer where FTE occurs. For example, Song showed that for northward IMF and LLBL, or low latitude boundary layer, has a stair-step plasma density profile with no evidence for plasma flow between the steps. It is a region through which the solar wind plasma has direct access to the low altitudes. The numerical simulations of K. Stewaskis shows that bubbles, magnetic, are produced by a Turing mode reconnection process driven by strong magnetopause currents and fluctuations of kinetic alpha waves. Research indicates that an instability gap exists at the polar staircase cusp where magnetic reconnection and FTE occurs. The FTE creates the gap of entry which appears during periods of enhanced far ultraviolet emission. FUV auroral luminosity accompanied by enhanced velocity flow channels are statistically associated with FTEs at the magnetopause. In other words, during a period of extended day side reconnection, there is a widening of the gap. The widening of the merging gap is observed in both the radar flow and the FUV emissions. This evidence is that the staircase cusp indicates the Turing mode instability, which creates a gap for magnetopause entry. The Egyptian descriptions of the deceased traveling to the polar cusp, finding the stairway merging with Ra, and looking for the gap at the winding waterway mirror magnetic spirit event studied by space physics decoded. Some bulk gods Sun God's bulk equals FTE at magnetopause, causing Turing mode instability. Great stairway equals staircase cusp. So actually, energy structures and processes exist at the element enriched polar cusp, such as the staircase signature and FTE. That could represent that the Egyptians called the Great Stairway and the ferry boat of Sun God. Oh. We could say that the deceased merging with the Sun God at the polar Great Stairway is similar to the ionospheric ions being entrained by FTEs moving into the polar magnetopause to trigger the staircase cusp. The winding waterway of the magnetopause. IS 24026 self-created Dead King Ferry on reed floats from west to east horizon on winding waterway. IS 27 Dead King travels causeway of happiness beneath firmament of sky. After the deceased climbs the great stairway at the gap of the polar cusp, he must go through the double ram gate and navigate to the winding waterway and sail in the 8 boat. We might view the deceased with his 8 traveling companions as plasma, a complex structure as an ordinary ion surrounded by a cloud of polarizable molecules moving through the magnetopause or winding waterway, which is always in motion. It is complicated, multi-layered structure which the solar wind must cross to enter the Earth's magnetosphere. As a barrier, it prevents most of the solar wind energy from entering the magnetosphere, but it cannot stop some energy entering at the cusp. The text refers to the path of the west, the causeway of happiness, the causeway beneath the firmament. May you stand up at the cusp, traveling the causeway, and the causeway in the meadow, suggesting a path through the wavy grasses of the meadow or the actual waves of the magnetopause discovered by the European Space Agency Cluster spacecraft 2001. So, the Earth's flowing magnetopause, the twisting channel separating Earth's electromagnetic barrier from the solar wind, is a reasonable model for the Egyptian winding waterway and the causeway. Also, Song describes 5 different regions during an inbound magnetopause crossing by the ISEE-1 spacecraft. These regions are present for all IMF direction. Physics are investigating magnetopause processes at the nearby boundary layer, the exterior cusp, and various high and low latitude boundary layers. Here, numerous types of transient events occur in mid and low altitude cusp regions. So let's take a closer look at the region, which may shed light on the idea of the sun bulk as a molecular assembly entering the magnetopause. The magnetopause of 2 ways. Recent research analyzing data from the DMSP spacecraft and the 3D miniaturized plasma detector aboard the Swedish Moonen and the Astrid spacecraft shows that the magnetopause current layer has a unique footprint, where current layer field lines map down to the low altitude ionosphere. Initially evidence from this model supports the Crooker interpretation of the cusp as a small-scale footprint of the magnetopause current layer, that is, true cusp. Just inside the magnetopause, layers exist called the low latitude boundary layer LLBL and the high latitude boundary layer HLBL, both of which extend far into the magnetotail. The dayside LLBL is highly structured and very sensitive to the direction of the sun IMF. When the IMF is southward, the coupling between the solar wind and the magnetosphere is strong. Geomagnetic activity is high and the energy transferred to the magnetosphere is maximized. With the northward IMF coupling is weak, geomagnetic activity low, and energy transfer diminished. Song found that for northward IMF, LLBL shows a stair-step plasma density profile. The funerary text states that the land is placed in the side of the Great West at the stairway of the Lotus Tank, at the place of the traveling upstream in the Lake of the Favored Ones. The idea of going upstream is similar to the advice that urges the deceased to pass on the upper road of Raset Jah, suggesting the HLBL. However, it seems possible that both the LLBL and the HLBL may be available paths for the deceased sun god. Plasma can enter the magnetosphere at low altitudes adjacent to the magnetospheric side of the magnetopause. One of the properties of the LLBL of the magnetopause is that the plasma can convect far tailward along the flank magnetopause. In addition, Newell and Ming showed that the LLBL is on open field lines just like the low altitude mantle, which reported on open field lines in open LLBL, a term coined by Lockwood to define an LLBL field lines having an open topology. Is characterized by accelerated flows of magnetosheath-like ions that are injected. Lockwood concluded that at least part of the magnetopause LLBL is formed by plasma mixing or field lines opened by magnetopause reconnection. Egyptian textual references indicate more than one pathway, stating that the deceased may cross the firmament, may he traverse the sky, may he travel safely on the fair path on which the blessed travel. So it seems possible that the magnetopause has fair pathways for the deceased, since both the LLBL and the HLBL may be routes to an open IMF line, although the texts prefer the upper path, that is, the HLBL of the magnetopause. Decoded, paths of the west equal LLBL and HLBL of the magnetopause. One must consider that the chaotic magnetospheric processes are those of reaction diffusion kinetics. So possibly all the deceased must do is to be in the right place at the right time. That is, at an origin of reconnection at the polar cusp, and the connects will transport him. For it during those last dying earthly moments, the deceased is able to gravitate or will his conscious molecular remains to the polar staircase site of reconnection. Then it seems that the events would unfold automatically, unveiling a different reaction pathway than the deceased would experience at any other location on Earth. It may be that the time immediately after death is crucial for achieving the desired chemical reaction. The question arises, how does one will a molecular consciousness to the cusp where an ordered set of chaotic events will occur? The Coriolis effect. The Coriolis effect. Okay. Perhaps the arrival event is an automatic process by means of the universal psychological experience at human death of tunneling to the light. Yet there is also the Coriolis effect, a geotropic force that only acts when air is moving. All points on Earth had the same rotational velocity, but when the object in the air moves west or east, the Coriolis effect deflects it to the north or south. This is because gravity pulls objects down and the ground holds them up. Air moving toward the poles curves to the east. Air moving away from the poles curves to the west. Air moving east curves towards the equator. Air moving west curves towards the poles. The Egyptian texts emphasize a movement to the beautiful west. And since Egypt is located in the northern hemisphere, air or an object heading west will be deflected north due to the Coriolis effect. Objects heading east will be deflected south. With the Egyptian instruction emphasizing a western path to the northern polar region, it seems possible that they were aware of the Coriolis effect, which would bring a west-moving entity to the northern polar region as a consequence of the principle of the conservation of angular momentum. Certainly other factors may influence the deceased's course. For instance, if we assume the deceased is a charged particle, then he would have three instinctive motions: gyrations around a magnetic field line, bounce motion along with magnetic field line, and drift motion across magnetic field lines. Also, electrons drift eastward while ions drift westward. So if the deceased in the afterlife is an ion, perhaps he can set his automatic pilot on cruise west and easily drift into the beautiful west, arriving in the cold polar north, an element enriched gap in the Earth's magnetosphere. The dynamics of the polar cusp. But if the deceased is an electron drifting west with protons, we could imagine the following scenario. The deceased decides to connect with solar and high energy ions at the magnetopause of the northern polar cusp by going toward the beautiful west via the Coriolis force. Arriving at the pole with his new depth vision, he sees actual energy landscapes of a great stairway or ladder. Radiant auroral shapes such as arcs, bands, raised pillars, draperies, and coronas, created by magnetic field lines and solar energy. The deceased climbs in the auroral great stairway, and according to the textual vice, he is at the famous gap in the western mountain or polar cusp, where he joins Ra ferry boat for the trip through the Duat. The first division of the boat of gates of the Duat, according to the sarcophagus of Seti I, shows the mountain of the west split open for the solar bark to sail through. The god is symbolized by the transformation beetle in the disk, encircled by a serpent, symbol of energy. The text states that the great god, whose transformations are manifold, will join together his members, suggesting molecular self-assembly. The deceased at the gap states, I fly and soar between those who great mountains in which Rai appears. Receiving the cuffs, we can easily explain its dynamics by noting 7 attributes and 1 warning. For this explanation, we will assume that the deceased represents a fermion, or a class of particles possessing half-integral units of intrinsic spin, intrinsic spin, electrons, muons, tau particles, neutrinos, quarks. This assumption seems reasonable for the text assert the deceased is reestablished in his original shape. And that's that picture right there, figure 2.4. First, the west to east movement. Recall the gap is the polar region of the weak magnetic field where the sun god enters the magnetopause. According to Russell, this is the source region of FTE. The deceased is advised not to travel on the western waterways, for those who travel thereon do not return. He must travel on the eastern waterways among the followers of Ra and in the east. In essence, we have potential for co-rotating and counter-rotating waterways. The text enforce a specific direction by constantly advising the deceased to turn over from his left side to his right side. This left to right movement parallels a west to east movement, a clockwise direction. The deceased begins his entry into the Duat at the gap, where reconnection occurs at the cusp, and the magnetic bubbles or islands and FTEs form. Yet at the gap, the dynamic pressure or ram pressure of the solar wind and the IMF directions determine the magnetopause position, which can vary by several Earth radii. In light of these factors, what makes the polar region of our planet so unique? Second, random high energy proton. One possible reason for Cusp uniqueness is the presence of high energy particles. For instance, the European Space Agency 3 cluster space satellites sailing over the northern polar cusp recently found high energy protons in the cusp. On August 30th, 2001, the first 2 satellites entered the cusp within 1 minute of each other and recorded the customary proton decrease in the cusp. The third spacecraft passed the cusp 45 minutes later and recorded the customary decrease in protons, followed by the sudden jump in the number of energy levels of protons 28 minutes later. Scientists explain this increase in proton and energy levels as the rapid motion of the cusp towards the northern pole, induced by the turning of IMF in the south to the north. This shows that at times there are higher energy protons in the cusp that may represent what the Egyptians refer to as the sun god or strong sunlight. But where do these high energy particles come from? Third, acceleration. According to NASA physicist Robert Sheldon, shock waves traveling out of the galactic disk transmit energy to the cusp and compress it. The cusp permits rapid stochastic diffusion because it is a quadruple trap requiring random energy impulses, possibly similar to those observed by cluster spacecraft. Uh, this makes the cusp a highly efficient acceleration. A quadruple is the sum of two dipoles such as this plasma, such as galactic cosmic rays or solar wind. Higher energy particles are less trapped in a quadruple than those with lower energy. Waves convecting the solar wind compresses trapped ions at the bowl shock, causing an energy enhancement. This activity during the substorm may result in highly energetic protons making their way into the cups during or after the event and turning off the IMF northward as cluster spacecraft observes. The importance of finding a ferry boat is stressed in the text. Fourth, higher energy, terrible power. I'm gonna say it again. The importance of finding a ferry boat is stressed in the text. Along with this, the deceased must greet Ra and his son and not be driven off by the Lord of Terror, greatly majestic. A fire is bound by Ra, which is bright against the deceased, who must join the fire, a possible representation of a higher energy enhancement in a plasma or charged particle. According to Yeling Lee at University of Colorado's Department of Aerospace Engineering Science, two main sources of energetic particles are galactic cosmic rays from supernovae explosions and solar energetic particles relative of coronal mass ejections. A third category discussed earlier is anomalous cosmic rays, which originate from interstellar neutral material, such as helium, nitrogen, and oxygen. Solar UV radiation ionizes these neutrals and accelerates them to Earth, where the ACRs become trapped in a third Van Allen belt. So they are a variety of high energy particles in the Earth's magnetosphere. However, Lee mentioned that the solar winds also contains a hot halo, an even hotter superhalo population of electrons that varies with solar wind activity. Lee said that this electron superhalo population did not have sufficient phase space density to supply the radiation belts within electrons. So perhaps the sun god's fire represents his superhalo of electrons that avoid the Van Allen belt. Fifth, a warning. Sheldon discovered trapped energetic electrons, not protons, in cosmic rays or solar winds in the outer cusp, suggesting that the possibility that the Van Allen radiation belts are filled from the cusp. Radiation belt electrons are formed by accelerating less energetic electrons, 500 to 300 keV, during substorm activity. If the deceased represents low energy electrons, it seems reasonable to infer that by boarding Ra's ferry boat on bonding to the energetic sun god, the deceased might empower his own molecular form with an energy greater than the cutoff 300 keV. thus saving himself from acceleration into the Van Allen belt, where, according to Sheldon, a second quasi-permanently trapped energetic particle population of electrons is present in the region of the Earth's outer cusp. Sheldon explains the use of this term quasi-trapping, but noting that time variation in the field prevent an infinite trapping time, though in a stationary magnetic field the trapping time is infinite. We could say that being quasi-trapped in the hot Van Halen belt might be a good approximation of the hell envisioned by the various religions, but simply it is important not to be driven off by the energetic sun god for the alternative to not bonding may be infinite trapping in the hot Van Allen belts. Fortunately, the sun god may represent a composition of ionized energetic plasma from not only the lower energy solar wind particles, but also the high energy GCR particles from the supernovae. The importance of having high energy to avoid the Van Allen belts may be why the deceased hates storms and worries about not finding a ferry boat, that is, not bounding to the sun god. It is interesting that the funerary texts resound with the advice to the deceased to avoid storms. During a substorm, the magnetosphere is shocked by the solar wind, which may temporarily stop the entry of the ambient cosmic rays particles at the cusp. Deceased receive warrants, power protection, and from Orion, the Duat grabs the deceased at the place where Orion is the birth of Orion will be prevented if the deceased does not access the sun god. The birth of Orion will be prevented if the deceased does not access the sun god. All right. The 6 cosmic rays from Orion. 6 cosmic rays from Orion. Let's go. Check me out. There we are. We back. Right on, right on. Y'all got me. 6 cosmic rays from Orion. Protons are the most abundant components of high energy cosmic rays particles. Sanuki reported energy ranges of 1 to 120 GeV as measured by the 1998 balloon flight of the BESS spectrometer launched from the Lynn Lake, Manitoba, Canada. Cosmic rays with energies of several billion electron volts have higher energy than those from the sun. The Orion region is a dense area about 2,000 very young